Today I'm out in Napa driving one of the most insane new vehicles you can buy in America today. This is the all-new Hummer SUV. Not to be confused with the Hummer pickup truck, which is basically this, plus a few extra inches in the back, and of course that pickup truck bed in the rear. The Hummer EV has been very divisive in EV circles because any way you look at this, it's totally insane. Practically every specification on the Hummer truck and Hummer SUV is absolutely bonkers, but the first thing you'll notice is probably the width of this vehicle. It is significantly wider than a Wrangler or a Bronco. In fact, many of the dimensions of the Wrangler could probably fit right here inside the Hummer logo between the turn signals in the front end. And this whole bar really makes it look even wider than it really is. It's so wide we have clearance lights on top and we have 3 windshield wipers rather than just 2 because of the width of that windshield. Now going in for a closer look, you'll notice that this light bar does not contain the headlights. Those are actually down here in the middle of this lower bumper portion. We have absolutely enormous shackles down here on the bottom. That's because, of course, the Hummer truck weighs over 9,000 pounds. This Hummer SUV is over 8,000, somewhere between 8 and 9,000 pounds. I don't have official curb weight specs just yet, but any way you slice it, the Hummer is definitely large and in charge. From this angle, you'll probably notice 2 things right away. The massive fender flares front and rear to accommodate the wide stance in the Hummer. It also really accentuates the look with the doors that come in a little bit. The cab is about the same width as a half-ton truck, but the body panels front and rear definitely push things out to the sides. You'll also notice this rear wheel, which is canted toward the outside. That's because this has standard 4-wheel steering. The rear tires will move a little bit over 11 degrees in the opposite direction as the front tires. To give this a turning radius, it's actually about the same as a Chevy Bolt. That really pays dividends in parking lot situations since this is so big, but also in off-road conditions. Moving around to the side, the truck and the SUV version of the Hummer share basically the same front half, but afterwards, the Hummer SUV has been shrunk versus the truck. And then, obviously, we don't have a truck bed back here. That means this is still a convertible. You can remove the 4 roof panel sections independently of one another. And we still have a big battery pack underneath the vehicle. In fact, you can really see how big it is if I open one of these doors, and then you see exactly where that seat's located there. The bottom approximately 18 inches of the vehicle is all battery. The next thing you're likely to notice is the spare tire on the rear. It has one and it is standard, which is a little bit different than the truck because in the truck there was nowhere to put the spare other than the bed, so you can get your Hummer truck without a spare or with a spare or with 2 spares if you so desire. This is perhaps the most imposing view for the Hummer because this really accentuates the width of the body with those massive fender flares back there, big taillights back here, and a really big 5th door. This is a door, not a hatch, because of course we have the spare tire back here, and because of the size and the weight of the door, it is powered both open and close. But no sensors back here to tell you not to run into the vehicle behind you other than just it will stop when it hits something, whether that is a human right here as the door closes, or somebody or something as the door opens. It actually stops pretty quickly, but you could still scuff that up if you're not paying too much attention in, say, a parking lot. One really handy touch, the glass does roll down, although, oddly enough, no wiper back here, even though we have 3 up front. Wondering about the charge door? You'll find that back here on the driver's side, CCS DC fast charge connector there, and the standard J1772 port. One quick correction before my inbox is flooded. This is the model with the more aggressive off-road package. You can tell because we have these slightly different wheels over here. There was some confusion earlier in the day. The tires are still Goodyear Wrangler tires, but these are the mud terrain, not the all-terrain versions. We have slightly different rock rails over here, and then of course the skid plates up front. But as you can see, the rest of the truck looks basically the same. Now let's get to the nitty-gritty. There are a decent number of specifications that GMC has not released for the new Hummer EV just yet. I, for instance, don't know the exact capacity of the battery pack. I suspect it's somewhere around 170 kilowatt hours. So definitely a big, big battery, but smaller than the one in the truck because, again, the wheelbase is shorter and they've removed 4 modules. The removal of 4 modules means that this is no longer an 800-volt DC system when charging. This is about 670 volts or so. So peak DC fast charge rates drop down to about 300 kilowatts peak, according to GMC. But it won't sustain that for too long. They've said that from 20% to 80% state of charge, this is going to average about 117 kilowatts. An important thing to note about the Ultium platform is that, at least for now, system voltage is defined by the number of modules that the vehicle has on board. Also, smaller number of module vehicles will not be able to do the serial versus parallel charging thing that we see in the Hummer line. Here's what happens in the Hummer truck and the Hummer SUV. If you take this to a 350 kilowatt station, say one of the new Electrify America stations, it's going to connect the upper battery pack and the lower battery pack in series. So it will present this as a 670 volt pack to the charger. That's when you can hit 350 kilowatts peak in the big battery Hummer, or about 300 kilowatts in this Hummer SUV. Now, if we're talking about a different Ultium platform vehicle that would only have a single layer pack, they're not going to have that option. The reason they do this is because you can also present the battery pack in parallel as basically a 335 volt pack, and that will charge at a lower rate, of course, with those older 400 volt stations, but it gives us the flexibility to charge at whatever rate your station supports without additional onboard electronics like, for instance, we find in a Porsche Taycan. There will be different versions coming later, but at the moment the Hummer SUV is available only in one power level, 830 horsepower and over 1,000 pound-feet of torque. The amount of horsepower is also dependent on the number of modules in the system, and that's why the Hummer truck is rated for more horsepower than this one is, but you'll still go 0 to 60 in 3.5 seconds in this nearly 9,000 pound SUV. So still very, very impressive. We don't have official EPA estimates just yet, but they should be coming because this will not be classified as a Class 3 truck. Because the Hummer truck is classified as a Class 3, it does not have to be EPA tested or officially crash tested, but this one will get both of those ratings. I wouldn't be surprised if the official range came in somewhere around 300 miles. Again, really big battery pack, but it could be a bit lower because so far today, we've been averaging about 1.4 miles per kilowatt hour. Now let's start to scratch the surface with some of these charging numbers. According to GMC, if you hit the exact right state of charge range and have the exact right charger and the battery is preconditioned, you could get 100 miles of range in about 14 minutes. Now, that is definitely less than you'll find in other EVs, but none of the other EVs out there are as big or as capable as this EV, so certainly keep that in mind. But any way you slice it, charging will take quite some time with a big battery like this. 10% to 80%, that's going to be somewhere between about 50 minutes and an hour because of the average charge rate that we find on board. Again, 117 kilowatts. So it is going to go up to about 300 kilowatts, and then it's going to come quite far down as the charge cycle completes to get that average of 117 from 20 to 80%. Certainly keep that in mind, but it does support battery preconditioning to help you get the best charge rate possible. Also know that not every charger out there is going to be able to support the maximum current draw from this vehicle, so GM has given us a little display in the instrument cluster to tell you exactly what's going on with the charger, so you know whether it's the charger or the vehicle as far as why it's not charging too quickly. Now, most people don't DC fast charge on a regular basis, so the AC charging via that regular J1772 port is probably more important. And that's where this really comes up trumps, because it's going to have an onboard charger rated for just over 19 kilowatts. That means that you can take this from 0% to 100% charged at home much more rapidly than the first generation Hummer EV trucks that came out because they had a much slower onboard charger. Now for 2023, the truck and the SUV both get the new onboard charger and the new vehicle to load capability. So not only will you be able to plug in an adapter here that will power things like a 240 volt appliance or your home or a saw or whatever it is you want to power, but you'll also be able to plug in a J1772 adapter here and one into another vehicle and then offload power to that other EV. When it comes to the onboard charging, GMC giveth and GMC taketh away, because the onboard EVSE is only a 32 amp rated EVSE. If you want to charge at 19 kilowatts or higher, you will have to buy that EVSE on your own, and those 100 amp EVSEs are pretty darn expensive. Let's start out our interior dive talking about the seating up front. We have 4-way adjustable lumbar support, a nice touch that honestly I wasn't expecting. I kind of expected to see 2-way lumbar in here like we find in some trucks in America. We do have a power memory linked tilt telescopic steering column, but the range of motion is somewhat limited. The other thing you'll notice is that the seating position in here is not quite the same as a traditional half-ton truck, even though this is based on the half-ton electric truck in GM's lineup. I'm sitting in perhaps a bit more of a reclined position because the body is a little bit shorter since we have that enormous battery pack underneath me. The Hummer certainly has a lot of ground clearance, and then of course we have that 18 inches worth of battery under there, and that really lifts you quite high off the ground as a driver or as a front passenger. Speaking of the front passenger seat, it has the exact same range of motion as the driver's seat. Hopping into the back seat, it's basically the same story. The seat bottom cushion is a little bit closer to the ground than the average half-ton truck or full-size SUV because of the general dimensions of this body. Also, you'll notice on the outside that the roofline does slope to the rear. It's not as boxy as you might imagine, and that does result in a little bit less headroom in the second row than you might think. The rear seats are also fairly reclined, I think to give you a bit more headroom feel inside, but if I lean my head back to the headrest, I only have about half an inch left. The reclining feature in the rear seats is fairly minor. You can see it moves maybe 3/4 of an inch there. It's a little bit difficult to see at this angle, but this large structural bar right over the second row seats is the limiting factor when it comes to headroom. Although not quite as practical as the Hummer truck, the Hummer SUV has a huge and very square cargo area. Also, as you'd expect, pretty darn wide. But like in the Hummer truck, the interior of the Hummer SUV is not as wide as the exterior might indicate. You can really see how much space on the side is used by the body cladding, the fender flares, etc. But still, a really large cargo area in the back. Also, very high load-in height. You can see this is about waist height for me at 6 feet tall. So if you are concerned about loading some of those larger cargo items inside, this is going to be a little bit harder on your back than some, but again, pretty big area. Front lovers rejoice, the Hummer has one up front. The button to open it is right there. And we find a front trunk that is a little bit easier to load than we find in the Rivian lineup currently because that section of the grille opens up, allowing you to load cargo a little bit lower, even though this is generally higher off the ground than the Rivian. The Rivian, you really have to load things in on top, and that does risk scraping up the bumper up front. This front trunk is not as big as the one that we find in the F-150 Lightning or in some of the other EVs that you'll find on the market. That likely has to do with the air suspension and the general unibody design of the Hummer. Now, this is a little bit controversial, but yes, the Hummer SUV and the Hummer truck are unibody vehicles. General Motors likes to call them body frame integral. That's a unibody because either you have a frame that is separate from the body or you don't, and it's a unibody. There are really only two things. There is not a third category. I'm sorry to shatter anybody's dreams, but the Hummer is a unibody vehicle, and that is absolutely not a problem because some of the best off-road vehicles in the world, Land Rovers, Range Rovers, Grand Cherokees, etc., are also unibody vehicles. It just has to do with the way that GM decided to design this vehicle. It has no impact on off-road capability or durability. Now let's go for a spin around the interior. As you'd expect, this is largely the same as the Hummer truck, so basically the same sort of controls up here just above that digital rear view mirror. This, of course, has OnStar. You can get different roof panels. There are opaque or translucent roof panels. These are the opaque roof panels, so no light shines through. Even though it kind of sort of looks like a moonroof, you can see the handles for removing that front section right there, the handles for removing the rear section back there. There are 4 panels that you can lift out and then they can store in the front trunk, so you don't have to leave them somewhere or worry about that. Moving over to the seating area, we have height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, 2-way adjustable headrests, big Hummer EV logo right there in the middle of that seat back, and these seats are both heated and ventilated. Bolsters on the front seat aren't terribly aggressive, so larger folks shouldn't have a problem with that, although I would love to see adjustable bolsters at some point in time. Those would be really handy for off-roading. Moving over to the front doors, we have a combination of hard plastics down at the bottom and then more premium soft touch materials up above there. This model has a very moon theme, I guess you could say, with this interior. We actually have moon maps on the speaker grills, moon-themed floor mats throughout as well. Big bottle holder down there at the bottom. Really handy grip there for off-roading, as well as a large chunky grip up there on the A-pillar. Moving over to the dashboard, basically the same sort of squarish design that we find in the Hummer truck. The width of this interior is definitely narrower than the first generation actual military Hummer, but about as wide as the average half-ton truck. A little bit different than GM's truck lineup, though, in that we don't have 2 glove boxes, so no storage area going on up here. We just have this one storage bin below. You can see it is a fairly small bin. I was not able to fit an 11-inch tablet computer inside. It is just a little bit too small. In the middle of the dashboard, we find this big LCD touchscreen infotainment system. Some folks have asked how I feel about the interior plastics and interior parts quality in here. I think I like the design of this. Some folks dislike the hard plastics we find in here. Keep in mind that hard plastics are generally going to be more durable, especially if you're really doing off-roading, have muddy things, dirty things in the vehicle. Soft plastics are not going to wear as well. But some people might expect softer materials in their $100,000 vehicle. If that is you, you might want to take a look at the Rivian. Back to this infotainment system. We have Apple CarPlay and Android Auto integration, but as you can see, it only occupies that small portion of the screen. The factory Google mapping occupies the entire screen. This is running GM's latest software package, which I have to say is really, really well featured. It has tons of camera views. We've got something like 13 cameras all the way around the vehicle, side cameras, top cameras, underbody cameras, hitch cameras, all that sort of stuff. off. Here's the underbody camera. You can see the back, you can see the front. So if you want to know where every tire is, you can see the inside and the outside of the tire in all sorts of different angles. We, of course, have GM's trailering features, and theoretically, this should be able to tow somewhere around 7,000 pounds. Official towing capacity for the Hummer SUV has not been released just yet. Below that touchscreen, we find a non-touchscreen section of the display. You can see we have toggles here. That's how you interact with that. I did find myself wanting to touch that section regularly, however. Down here, we have controls for the heated steering wheel, rear locker, front locker. That's really cool. Keep in mind, of course, the rear locker is not a traditional locker. It's an e-locker, so it's not going to behave quite the same. Down here we have 2 air vents, a large storage area with a wireless charging mat, 2 USB inputs, and you can use either wired or wireless CarPlay here. 2 big cup holders over there, a joystick style shifter here. This is the drive mode selector. It also controls the crab walk. This is not a Masonic symbol over here, although it does look like it belongs on the $1 bill. That's the programmable My Mode button. And then down here you can see that we have a huge storage area under this sort of floating center console. That's enabled by the flat floor we have in this dedicated battery electric platform. That's a really cool touch, and it really differentiates this from something like the Lightning or some of the other EVs that don't have this kind of functionality, especially vehicles that are based on more traditional platforms. Moving over here to the driver's side, we have a very eccentric instrument cluster. It has these cut-ins at the bottom. I kind of wish they'd given us a square display with a bit more information, but as we see in a lot of different GM vehicles, tons of information is provided on this display, and it's highly configurable. Moving down from there, we find the Hummer EV steering wheel, big chunky controls for the adaptive cruise control over there. This, of course, has Super Cruise, so we have that little indicator on top. And that's also why we find the driver monitoring module there on top of the steering column. Controls over here adjust that multifunction LCD cluster over there. The last thing to know on the steering wheel is this regen paddle on the left side. This is not adjustable throttle liftoff regen like we find in some EVs. You can enable and disable one-pedal driving mode in the infotainment system, however. This paddle is just regen on, regen off, but it's not max regen. It actually is, I don't know, kind of moderate. It will take you to essentially a complete stop, but it is not the most adjustable thing. And I think I would rather just have paddles on the back that would let you adjust that regen up and down. Now it's time to get the Hummer out on the road. The first thing you'll notice is the amount of power we get from this tri-motor setup. 830 horsepower total, over 1,000 pound-feet of torque, riding on mud terrain tires in this top-end version with the advanced off-road package. This is definitely a handful, but it is very, very fast. Now, 0 to 60 time in here, and the horsepower total is a little bit lower than the regular Hummer because of the battery pack. It's missing those 4 modules. The removal of those 4 modules drops the nominal voltage of the pack to the electric motors down to 335 volts from about 400 volts in the regular Hummer, and when DC fast charging, it will serial the packs together, present it as a 670 volt pack to the charger versus 800 volts in the regular Hummer truck. That's the reason that power drops down, and that's the reason that performance is a little bit lower, but it is just as bonkers. And as we see in other EVs with powerful front electric motors, there is torque steer in here. And that's simply due to the fact that we don't have a mechanical connection between the front wheels and the back wheels. The feel of this system as a result of that powerful electric motor is not far off a Tesla Plaid or the high horsepower versions of the Rivian R1T and R1S. Now, out on the road and out on the trail, you will notice a bit of a difference between this tri-motor setup and the 4-motor setup that we find in the Rivian. In the Rivian, the wheels are scrabbling along on an off-road trail very much like the average crossover, like a RAV4 or something along those lines. And that's because it does not have the ability to truly lock the 2 front wheels together or the 2 rear wheels together. In this, it's maybe a variation on the theme. You can lock the front axle with this locker over here, and that will give you an actual lock of the front axle, but in the tri-motor setup, there's no true lock going on in the rear. So the rear tires are always going to be spinning at slightly different rates. The electric motor setup will attempt to give you a e-locker back there, but here's what's going on. Much like a crossover like a RAV4 or a CRV or an Escape, etc., a wheel has to slip before the system decides it needs to send more power across to the other side. Then, of course, remember that you cannot combine the output of those 2 massive electric motors in the rear and deliver all that power to a single wheel. All you've got on a wheel is what that motor is set for. On this vehicle, though, on the front axle, things are a little bit different because the front axle can lock and you can send the entire front motor output to just one single front wheel. The other thing you'll notice out on the road is the really aggressive EV sound that this vehicle is playing. I'm not the biggest fan of EV soundtracks, and this one does come across as a little extreme. Fortunately, you can quiet it down. You can go over here to the My Mode motor sound and you can put it in relaxed. It essentially goes away. The one thing to keep in mind is that it is speed and throttle dependent. So out on the highway, it is really loud and really droning, which is weird because the cabin in here is actually pretty quiet. We have that enormous battery pack beneath us, and especially if you get the all-terrain tires or the all-season tires that are standard, it's going to be quiet in here relative to the average half-ton truck. If you get these mud terrain tires, it's going to be louder, but it's actually still pretty quiet compared to a lot of off-road vehicles with dedicated off-road rubber. So something like a Bronco Raptor, it's definitely going to be louder in the cabin than this. This is a strange experience in that way. It's this combination of absolute bonkers, enormous dimensions, and a little bit of civility tossed in here and there. Now, there's certainly a lot of body roll, just as you'd expect. This has an air suspension. It is fantastically heavy. It's riding on 305 width mud terrain tires, not as wide as you might expect for a curb weight this heavy. So keep that all in mind when you start trying to carve your favorite winding mountain road like this a little bit too quickly. This is not going to handle like a Bronco or even something like a Wrangler. The Wrangler is not the best handling thing on the planet. It is still going to cut a corner perhaps a little bit more elegantly than this because of the size and the weight. And you will really notice the size. Earlier in our Odyssey, we were driving this from downtown San Francisco, not its natural habitat at all, up here towards rural Napa County, and it felt very wide. I was definitely white-knuckling it on the Golden Gate Bridge. On city streets, it feels just as wide. Based on our estimate that this battery pack is around 167 kilowatts, that would put this at a real-world range of maybe 210 to 220 miles, depending on how you're driving it. Obviously, you'll get longer range if you get the regular tire setup. These knobblier off-road tires are definitely going to have a big impact on your range. Also keep in mind that when the EPA range figures come out for this vehicle, and we will be getting them according to General Motors, that is going to be a combined range figure, highway plus city, and these numbers are probably more applicable to highway driving, especially if you're driving 70, 75, or 80 miles an hour like you can in some states, especially if you live in Texas and you're interested in a Hummer. You're not going to be going that far out on the open highway. And then if you're adding a camper or a roof tent or you're towing something, etc., keep those range figures in mind. You're going to be dropping down more towards 100 miles of all-electric range, even with this absolutely massive battery pack. And that's simply the reality of driving an off-road vehicle. A lot of people are going to be upset about that, but these same people don't think twice about the fact that a Ford Raptor is going to get 12 miles per gallon, and that is really terrible versus a RAV4 Prime. These are not the same kind of vehicles. If you want the kind of off-road capability you'll find in this vehicle, that comes with shorter range and lower efficiency. It's just the way things are. Now, you will find higher efficiency in the Rivian R1S. That is mainly because it is narrower and it's a little bit more focused on aero than this vehicle, but the size is definitely a critical thing. It has narrower tires, it's lower to the ground, it has an aero mode where it actually gets very, very low to the ground compared to this Hummer. All of that is really going to impact your range and your efficiency scores, so if that's what you're interested in, you're going to want to shop over there. If you want the rough and tumble look and the absolutely enormous dimensions, you're simply going to have to pay the piper. The other thing to keep in mind with Rivian comparisons is that there are 3 battery packs in the Rivian lineup. Most of the vehicles going off the line have the big battery. It's about 130 kilowatt hours in total capacity. There's also going to be a max pack that's going to be about 200 kilowatt hours in capacity. According to Rivian, that should get you about 400 miles of range in the R1S if you get the road tires and all the right options, all the right settings, etc. The R1S does have a range extending mode, which is quite effective as far as conservation goes. It lowers the vehicle down and it just uses the front electric motors for the maximum efficiency. In kind of a weird twist, we don't see any sort of range extending mode in the Hummer, and that's another thing that I would really love to see. I would love to see something like a mechanical rear axle disconnect. A range extending mode, I think, is a very rational vehicle in something like this, even though it is targeted at an off-road audience, because you want to be able to get to the back of Beyond and get home, and you can't always charge out there in the back of Beyond. So you have to be able to maximize your efficiency getting there, do whatever it is you want to do there, and then maximize your efficiency getting back home. Until we live in a world where there are going to be DC fast chargers at every national park, every BLM property, every private campground, etc., this is certainly something that you need to keep in mind. Obviously, this is not going to win any handling awards with the tires and the ground clearance that we have on this model, but I would be intrigued to see what a street performance truck would be like from General Motors, and they certainly have the bones to do that. Maybe they're going to do that at some point in time with the upcoming Silverado EV and the Sierra EV. The bones of this are going to be transplanted basically directly into those trucks. Different battery packs, different electric motors here and there, but a lot of what makes the Hummer really interesting is going to be applied to those trucks in maybe a more pragmatic, more rational format. Let's talk a bit more about regenerative braking. There are multiple ways of controlling it in the Hummer. We have the micro paddle on the back of the steering wheel. I do find that a little bit tiny, maybe a little bit silly. We can then adjust the throttle liftoff regen in the infotainment system, and there are 3 different levels. There's basically imitating an ICE vehicle, so relatively modest regen. We have normal one-pedal drive mode, and then we have high regen for the one-pedal drive mode. High is pretty aggressive. Coming to this stop here, and if I do that, it's not quite an emergency braking maneuver, but it also oddly gets stronger as you come to a stop. This vehicle does have blended braking, so this is not like a Tesla or a Rivian where the throttle liftoff regen is all you get. If you put your foot on the brake pedal, you get more regenerative braking into the battery until the system decides it needs to start blending in the friction braking. Because this vehicle has a blended braking system, it is going to feel different than the Rivian, because the Rivian does not. When you put your foot on the brake pedal, it's just going to be operating the friction brakes. When you lift your foot off the accelerator pedal, that is all the regen you will get in that system. Hence, blended braking, not blended braking over there. There are definitely pros and cons here. The brake pedal feel in a Rivian is definitely more normal than this. Also in a Tesla, more normal than this. This does have a bit of a kind of a disconnect between when the friction brakes are engaging and when they're not. On the other hand, a blended braking system like this gives you a bit more control over exactly how much power you're stuffing back into the battery, and in really aggressive braking maneuvers, you'll actually be putting more energy back into the battery than is possible in those other systems, because the moment you touch the brake pedal in any of those vehicles that doesn't have blended braking, you're basically leaving electrons on the table, and in this kind of system, you're not. This also gives the ability to control your speed going downhill a little bit more easily, a little bit more finely if you have a heavy load in the vehicle or if you're towing a trailer in the back. So a little bit less of a concern of brake overheating in the vehicle and in the trailer as well. I don't have a good answer at the moment as far as whether the single pedal system in this system will engage the trailer brakes, because we have a trailer brake controller here, but I don't have a trailer connected, so I can't see exactly what's going on. But I suspect it probably does. If it's anything like the other EV trucks that are out there, once you hit a specific level of deceleration, number of Gs, it seems like it will engage the trailer brake controller in the back. And in something like the Ford Lightning, essentially it's whenever the brake lights are engaged in the vehicle, that's when it's going to engage the trailer brake controller, even the integrated one. So that doesn't seem to be a concern, but hopefully we'll get a better answer on that when we can get this back in the office and do a complete review. Sorry for this video being a little bit different than normal, but right now it is sunny. I haven't been able to spend too much time in this Hummer. We have been able to explore a little bit on an off-road course and drive around, but the sun is setting right over there, and tomorrow it's going to be pouring rain the entire day that we will be behind the wheel of the Hummer. And that's why you'll notice that some of the drive sections, etc., are in the rain, because that's what's going on tomorrow. Now, let me know what you think about the Hummer SUV down there in the comments section below. Is it inefficient? You betcha. Is it big? Is it crazy? Is it insane? Is it bonkers? Yes, all of those things together. And that is why I love the Hummer and the Hummer truck so much. These are the electric personification of crazy vehicle. And some people say that that has no future in America or in an electrified world. And I would say, if you want to convince everybody that they should be driving an electric vehicle, and I mean everybody from top to bottom, then we need every form of vehicle electrified, from tiny commuter cars to convertibles to sports cars to big bonkers off-road vehicles like the Hummer SUV and the Hummer truck. And that is exactly what this thing is. This is the biggest, brashest, most in-your-face electric vehicle you can possibly buy in America today. And for that, I absolutely love it, but I probably would never buy one myself. But I am absolutely thrilled that this exists for someone that maybe could be convinced to get out of something else and into something like this Hummer EV. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comments section below. Of course, hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for other videos. We will get our hands on a Hummer truck and a Hummer SUV for complete testing at home pretty soon. There's actually probably going to be a Hummer truck coming up pretty shortly, so be sure and stay tuned for that video. In the meantime, find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all those other social places. See all of you next week.